What would you do if someone with a badge decided, in that very moment, that the rules didn't apply to them? No shouting, no warning, just the weight of their authority pressing down on you, daring you to push back. In a quiet coastal town, one late-night encounter would spark a chain of events no one saw coming. It began with a woman who had spent her entire career earning respect the right way, and a man who believed the badge on his chest gave him the right to take it from her. What he didn't know was that his greatest mistake wasn't stopping her, it was underestimating her. This is a story about power, the kind that can be abused in seconds, and the kind that's earned over a lifetime. If you're new here, hit that like button, subscribe, and make sure you watch until the very end, because what starts as a quiet confrontation is about to turn into a fight that will change everything. It was just after 11 p.m. when the streets of Bayhaven, a small coastal city where the sea breeze rolled in heavier than the night traffic, had gone almost completely still. Only the occasional fishing truck rumbled past, carrying the day's catch toward the market, and a few streetlights hummed softly against the dark. Helen Carter drove her silver sedan down Harbor Street, the kind of car that didn't stand out in any crowd. Clean, practical, dependable. Her day had started at sunrise with budget meetings and ended in a late-night crisis at the hospital's surgical wing. She was tired, but her mind was already shifting into that quiet space between work and home, humming faintly to the radio as the familiar landmarks slipped past her window. She wasn't speeding. She wasn't swerving. She was just going home. But that's when she noticed the dark SUV idling on the side of the road. Its headlights were off, but the faint glow of a dashboard screen gave away the silhouette of someone inside. The vehicle pulled out without hesitation, falling in behind her. The red and blue lights snapped on. Helen's foot eased off the gas as her pulse quickened, not from guilt, but from the sudden jolt of being pulled over so late at night. She guided her car to the curb, parked neatly, and rested her hands on the wheel. Years of hospital crisis management had taught her one thing: stay calm, no matter who walks through the door. The driver's door of the SUV slammed shut. Out stepped a tall man in a dark city-issued jacket, his badge clipped to the chest pocket. He didn't approach with a greeting, just a flashlight beam cutting directly across her face. "Evening, ma'am. Derek Lawson, City Code Enforcement," he said flatly. "Need to see your license and proof of residence." Helen blinked. "Code Enforcement, at this hour?" He didn't answer the question. "License, proof of residence." Louder this time, like the volume itself carried authority. Something in his tone told her this wasn't a routine request, but she didn't argue. Not yet. She reached slowly for her bag, her movements deliberate, and handed over her ID, that address still current. Lawson asked. "Yes," she said. "And if you don't mind me asking, what's this about?" "You were seen returning from the restricted docks area," he replied, as if that explained everything. "I work at Bayhaven Regional Hospital. I was coming from there." Lawson tilted his head, a smirk flickering. "Hospital work doesn't put you above the law, Ms. Carter." Her jaw tightened, but she kept her voice even. "Never said it did." That's when he stepped closer, his flashlight beam dropping to her lap. Then the glove box. "I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle." Helen's pulse slowed, not from fear, but from focus. She knew how fast moments like this could turn. Without a word, she reached into her coat pocket, pulled out her phone, and tapped the record button. "Just so we're clear," she thought, "you picked the wrong person to corner tonight." Helen stepped out of the car, the cool night air mixing with the faint scent of saltwater drifting up from the marina. She kept her phone steady in her hand, its small red recording light glowing in the darkness. Lawson noticed it, his eyes narrowing for just a second, but his expression quickly reset into the same stony glare. "Over here," he ordered, pointing toward the front of her car. "Stand where I can see you." Helen complied, her posture straight, but relaxed. Years of hospital leadership had taught her that control wasn't about volume, it was about presence. She wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. Lawson circled the vehicle slowly, his flashlight tracing across the tires, the bumpers, the windshield. "You live on Shoreline Drive, right?" he asked without looking at her. "Yes, that area's been getting complaints, late-night traffic, unreported deliveries. You wouldn't happen to know anything?" About that, would you? No, she said simply. He finally stopped in front of her, the flashlight beam hitting the pavement between them. See, the thing is, people think just because they've got a nice job or a nice address, they can skirt the rules. But those rules, they apply to everyone. Even hospital administrators. Helen's phone stayed steady. And those rules also apply to city employees, she said, her voice calm but cutting. For the first time, his smirk faltered. Careful, he warned. Obstructing an inspection can get you cited. I haven't obstructed anything, she replied. I've answered your questions. I've complied with every request. I just want to know the reason for this stop. Lawson leaned in slightly, lowering his voice like they were sharing a secret. The reason is, I can do it. And right now, you're on my time. That was the moment Helen knew this wasn't about code enforcement at all, it was about control. And he was testing just how far he could push it. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't step back. She simply said, "Then I suppose you won't mind explaining that on record." His gaze flicked to the phone again, and for a fraction of a second, there was hesitation. Not enough to stop him, but enough for her to know she had hit the first crack in his armor. What Lawson didn't realize was that Helen had been here before, not in a parking lot, with a city official, but in countless rooms with arrogant board members, reckless surgeons, and people who thought their position made them untouchable. And she had beaten them all the same way, by letting them reveal themselves. And tonight, Derek Lawson was doing exactly that. Lawson walked back to his SUV, muttering something into his radio that Helen couldn't quite catch. He lingered there for a moment, the glow of his dashboard lighting up his face as he typed on a small laptop, mounted to the center console. The street was silent except for the faint hum of the idling engine. When he returned, he was holding a small clipboard and a ticket pad. Failure to comply with inspection protocol. He read aloud, like a judge delivering a sentence. You'll be receiving a fine in the mail. Helen glanced at the form, noting the vague wording, the lack of any actual violation cited. And this is based on what? She asked. His lips curled into something between a smirk and a sneer. Based on my assessment. You can dispute it if you want. Good luck. She took the ticket without another word. The paper felt flimsy in her hand, like it was already crumbling under the weight of its own nonsense. But Helen knew better than to argue now. This was his arena. Out here, at this hour, with no one else watching, he thought he held all the cards. Lawson turned on his heel and climbed back into his SUV. A second later, the red and blue lights cut out, and the vehicle rolled away into the night, disappearing down the empty street. Helen stood there for a moment beside her car, letting the sound of the waves in the distance replace the echo of his voice in her head. She replayed every word, every gesture, every pause in the conversation like a surgeon reviewing an operation, noting exactly where the mistakes had been made. Sliding back into the driver's seat, she set her phone on the console and glanced at the glowing red recording saved icon. It was a small thing, but it was leverage, and she knew exactly how to use it. By the time she pulled into her driveway, her plan was already forming. This wasn't going to be a phone call to a friend at City Hall. This wasn't going to be a quiet warning. She was going to take this as far as it could go, not because of the fine, but because of the principle. Because if Lawson could do this to her, he could do it to anyone who didn't have the tools to fight back. Helen didn't slam her door when she got out. She didn't stomp up the walkway. She moved with the same calm precision she'd shown during the stop. Because the most dangerous person in any fight is the one who never raises their voice. By the next morning, Bayhaven was already awake, the harbor clanging with the sound of boats unloading, gulls crying overhead, and the scent of salt and diesel drifting inland. Derek Lawson sat in his cramped city code enforcement office, sipping burnt coffee from a paper cup and scrolling through his inbox like nothing had happened. The night before, this was routine for him. Most nights, he'd patrol well past his assigned routes, looking for violations that might justify a citation or at least a confrontation. The badge on his chest wasn't about safety, it was about leverage. And Bayhaven's tangled web of municipal codes gave him plenty to work with. In the break room, a younger officer named Chris Myers leaned against the counter, stirring sugar into his coffee. Heard you pulled someone over last night. Harbor Street, right? Lawson smirked without looking up. Just doing my job. Chris tilted his head. Wasn't that after curfew hours for inspections? Lawson glanced at him briefly, then went back to his laptop. The book says I can check suspected violations anytime. And I suspected her. Chris didn't press further, but the pause that followed was thick. Lawson liked that he liked making people uncomfortable, keeping them on edge. In his mind, hesitation was just another form of submission. What he didn't know was that Helen Carter was already moving. That same morning, she sat in her office at Bayhaven Regional Hospital, reviewing the footage from her phone. She watched the way Lawson had approached, the way he'd framed his questions, the smirk when he thought he had the upper hand. She noted the timestamp, the location, the language he used, all of it precise, documented, irrefutable. Helen's assistant, Karen, stepped in with a stack of files. "Rough night?" she asked gently. Helen looked up, her expression calm but unreadable. "You could say that. I need you to call Robert Hayes in legal. Tell him it's urgent." Karen raised an eyebrow. Robert Hayes was the hospital's legal counsel, and Helen didn't bring him in unless something serious was brewing. "Everything okay?" Helen turned back to the screen, hitting pause just as Lawson's flashlight beam hit her face. "Not yet, but it will be." 2 nights later, on the far side of Bayhaven, Lawson's SUV rolled slowly through a narrow residential street. The houses here were old weathered clapboard siding, porches that creaked under the weight of the ocean air. He preferred these neighborhoods. Fewer cameras, fewer witnesses willing to step outside. He stopped in front of a small, one-story home with a battered fishing boat parked in the driveway. The porch light flicked on before he even got out of the vehicle. A man in his late 50s stepped out, pulling a cardigan tight around his shoulders. "Evening," Lawson called, clipboard in hand. "City code enforcement. Got a report about unregistered equipment on your property." The man frowned. "That's my boat. Had it for 20 years. Registered every season." Lawson flipped a page, pretending to scan for details. "Not according to our records. I'll need to come in and take a closer look." "You're not coming inside," the man said firmly. Lawson's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Refusing an inspection? That's a violation. I can issue a citation right now, or we can talk inside and work this out." The man's shoulders tightened, but he didn't move. "Then write your ticket." For a moment, they just stared at each other. Lawson liked these moments, the power in deciding whether to push harder or pull back. This time, he wrote the ticket, tearing it from the pad with a sharp rip and tossing it toward the porch. Back in his SUV, he glanced at his reflection in the rearview mirror and grinned. Most people didn't fight. Most people just paid. That was how he liked it. But in a tidy office across town, Helen Carter was building a case to show exactly how many people had been cornered like that. Her legal counsel, Robert Hayes, leaned over her desk, scanning the printouts she'd prepared, timestamps, locations, city policy excerpts, all matched to the video from her phone. "You've got him on overreach," Robert said finally. "Maybe even intimidation. But to make it stick, we'll need more. Other incidents. Witnesses." Helen leaned back in her chair, her eyes steady. "Then let's find them." Robert Hayes didn't waste time. By the next morning, he had reached out to a contact in the Bayhaven city clerk's office. The request was simple: every public complaint, citation, or dispute involving Derek Lawson in the last 3 years. What came back wasn't a neat stack of papers, it was a flood. Pages and pages of small infractions, late-night citations, and unresolved grievances, most dismissed without explanation. It was a pattern hiding in plain sight. Helen sat at the long conference table in the hospital's boardroom, flipping through the files. "He's been doing this for years," she said quietly. Robert nodded. "And the city's been letting him. People either don't have the resources to fight or they're too intimidated to try." Helen traced her finger down a page, stopping at a name: Sarah Lundy. The complaint was nearly identical to hers, stopped without clear cause. Pressured to allow a search, issued a vague citation. "I want to talk to her," Helen said. Within hours, she was sitting in a small cafe on Bay Street, the ocean breeze pushing against the glass. Sarah was in her early 40s, a school teacher with a quiet, careful way of speaking. "He showed up at my house after 9 o'clock, Sarah said, wrapping her hands around her coffee cup. Said there was a noise complaint. I live alone. My lights weren't even on. Helen listened, letting Sarah recount every detail. The flashlight in the eyes, the clipped tone, the way he lingered just a step too close. You didn't file a formal suit? Helen asked. Sarah shook her head. I didn't think anyone would believe me. And even if they did, he's still got that badge. Helen leaned forward. That badge isn't going to protect him forever. Not if enough of us speak up. For the first time, Sarah's eyes shifted from wary to curious. You're actually doing something about him. Helen smiled faintly. More than something. I'm building a record. By the time she left the cafe, she had 3 more neighbors of Sarah's who had their own stories. The threads were starting to weave together, and Helen knew that once you saw the full picture, it was impossible to unsee it. Lawson was halfway through his lunch lukewarm chowder from a takeout cup when he noticed Chris Myers watching him from across the break room. Not the casual, bored kind of glance co-workers shared. This was different, focused. You got something to say? Lawson asked, setting the spoon down. Chris hesitated, then shrugged. Just heard your name come up in the clerk's office this morning. Someone's been pulling your case files. Lawson's jaw worked slowly. Who? Chris took a long sip of coffee. Don't know. But word is, they're not looking for building permits. It wasn't the first time Lawson had faced pushback. An angry homeowner here, a frustrated shop owner there, but the city had always backed him up. Still, there was something in the way Chris said it that made him feel exposed. He didn't like that feeling. Back at his desk, Lawson opened his inbox and found a notice from the city attorney's office. Request for documentation related to code enforcement activities. Officer Lawson, please respond within 72 hours. He leaned back in his chair, the chowder turning heavy in his stomach. Someone was moving fast, across town. Helen was moving faster. Robert Hayes had just confirmed 6 willing witnesses, each with nearly identical stories. Late-night stops, vague accusations, pressure to comply without warrants. She had a growing list, and now official city paperwork proving she wasn't the only one. Once we file the formal complaint, Robert said, he'll know it's you. Helen didn't flinch. Good. Let him. Robert gave a short nod. Then it's time to put him on notice. Helen slid the stack of signed witness statements across the table. Do it, and make sure the delivery is personal. I want him to read my name first thing. Some fights were won in public. Others were won the moment your opponent realized the ground under them had started to shift. And Lawson was about to feel the first cracks. It was late afternoon when the receptionist at Bayhaven's code enforcement office buzzed Lawson's desk. Someone here to see you, she said. Says it's official business. Lawson glanced at the clock for 12 p.m. He wasn't expecting any appointments. Send M back, he replied, his tone casual, almost bored. A man in a dark blazer stepped into the doorway, holding a slim manila envelope. Derek Lawson, that's me. The man's expression didn't change as he extended the envelope. You've been served. Please sign here to confirm receipt. Lawson's eyes flicked to the return address stamped in bold at the top. Robert Hayes, attorney at law, and beneath it, the name that made his mouth go dry. Helen Carter. What's this about? Lawson asked, though the knot in his gut already knew. The server simply said, all the details are inside, before turning and walking out without another word. Lawson stared at the envelope for a long moment, then tore it open. The first page was short and sharp. Formal complaint filed with the Bayhaven City Attorney's Office, alleging abuse of authority, harassment, and unlawful detainment, accompanied by witness statements and recorded video evidence. His grip tightened around the paper until it creased. He scanned further, and the list of witnesses jumped out, names he recognized from past stops. And at the top of the plaintiff's list, bold and unmissable, was Carter, Helen M. For the first time in years, Lawson felt the room shrink around him. Across town, Helen sat in her office, not checking the time, not wondering if the envelope had been delivered. She knew it had. She pictured him reading her name, realizing she wasn't another frightened citizen who'd pay the fine and keep quiet. Robert stepped in, carrying his own copy of the filed complaint. It's done, he said. Helen simply replied, good. Now we wait for his next move. But deep down, she wasn't waiting at all. She was already thinking 3 steps ahead. Lawson didn't go home that night. Instead, he drove straight to a low-lit bar on the edge of town where a handful of city employees like to gather after hours. He found 2 familiar faces, Rick Parsons from Public Works and Janice Holloway from the Zoning Board, both of whom had owed him favors in the past. "She's trying to take me down," Lawson said, sliding into the booth without waiting for an invitation. "Helen Carter, hospital admin. You know her?" Janice exchanged a glance with Rick. "I know of her," she said cautiously. "She's connected. Not the kind of person you want to spar with in public." Lawson leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Then help me keep it out of public. Letters of support. Anything to make it look like I've been doing everything by the book." Rick raised an eyebrow. "By the book? Derek, you've been skating around the edges for years. People talk. That's why I need people like you to say otherwise," Lawson shot back. Janice sipped her drink, her expression unreadable. "Even if we could, she's got video. I heard it's clear as day." The words landed heavier than the whiskey in his glass. Meanwhile, Helen was on the other side of town in Robert's office, reviewing their growing stack of evidence. Robert had arranged for the video from her phone to be time-synced with the city's own patrol logs, creating a timeline no lawyer could easily dismantle. "And here's the kicker," Robert said, sliding a new folder across the desk. Inside were city payroll records showing Lawson had logged overtime for the night of her stop hours, well past the legal limit for enforcement activity. Helen smiled faintly. So not only was he overstepping his authority, he was getting paid extra to do it. Robert tapped the folder. "It's leverage. And if he tries to go public with his version first, we'll bury him in facts before he gets a single headline." Helen closed the folder and sat back. "Then let's make sure he knows I'm not bluffing." Robert's conference room looked less like a lawyer's office and more like a command center. Binders lined the table in precise stacks, each labeled with a date and subject: video evidence, witness statements, city records, overtime logs. Helen stood at the head of the table, her hands resting lightly on the back of a chair as Robert moved between piles. "The first hearing isn't about winning," he reminded her. "It's about framing the narrative. The judge needs to see you as credible and controlled, not emotional." Helen nodded. "Controlled is what I do." Robert smirked. "I know. That's why I'm not worried about you losing your temper. But I do want you ready for his lawyer's tactics. They'll try to make this about you overreacting, not about him overstepping." He opened a binder to a still frame from her phone footage. Lawson, leaning too close, flashlight beam glaring across her face. "This image stays with people. Its power in visual form. We'll use it to anchor your testimony." Helen studied the photo for a long moment. "Do we have the others lined up?" "All 6, Robert said, sliding a sheet across the table. Each name had a brief summary: location, date, type of harassment. 3 of them will be in court for the hearing. The others are ready for depositions." Helen read through the list, her eyes narrowing slightly. "I want Sarah Lundy to be the first witness. She's calm, steady. If she cracks his defense early, it sets the tone." Robert nodded. "Agreed. And after her, we play the videos back to back, yours, then his. No commentary. Let the footage speak." Helen gathered her notes, her movements deliberate. "When we walk into that courtroom, I want him to understand something. This isn't just about what he did to me. This is about what he's done to this town." Robert leaned back in his chair. "Then let's make sure the judge sees exactly that." The Bayhaven Municipal Courthouse wasn't large, just 3 floors of faded brick and narrow hallways that smelled faintly of paper and old coffee. But that morning, the air inside was heavier, charged in a way Helen could feel the moment she stepped through the doors. Robert walked beside her, carrying a slim briefcase instead of the bulging binders they'd been working through all week. "We don't bring everything today," he'd told her earlier. "Just enough to let them know we've got more." In the hallway outside courtroom 2, Derek Lawson was already there, leaning against the wall in a pressed shirt and sport coat. His lawyer, a sharp-jawed man named Dennis Fuller, was speaking to him in low tones. Lawson's eyes flicked up when he saw Helen, and for just a second, the easy smirk he'd worn the night of the stop tried to make a return. But it didn't quite land. Helen didn't give him the satisfaction of a reaction. She walked past him without slowing, her posture straight, her eyes forward. The way she walked hospital corridors when every second mattered. Inside, the room was small, with only a few rows of benches. 3 of Helen's witnesses were seated together in the second row, Sarah Lundy among them. Her hands folded tightly in her lap. Across the aisle, 2 city employees Helen didn't recognize sat behind Lawson. The bailiff called the room to order, and Judge Elaine Porter, a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and a reputation for zero patience, took the bench. "This is Carter versus Lawson," she began. "Today we will hear preliminary statements and review motions regarding discovery. Counsel for the plaintiff, you may proceed." Robert rose smoothly. "Your Honor, this is a case about the misuse of municipal authority. We intend to show not only that my client was subjected to harassment and unlawful detainment, but that the defendant has a documented pattern of similar conduct." Fuller stood when it was his turn, his voice measured. "Your Honor, the defense maintains that Mr. Lawson was acting within the scope of his duties at all times. The plaintiff's claims are exaggerated, based on a misunderstanding of standard procedure." Helen kept her gaze fixed on Judge Porter as the opening words were traded, refusing to let Lawson see her watching him. She could feel his presence just a few feet away, but it didn't matter. This wasn't his turf anymore. When the judge set the dates for depositions and the next hearing, Helen caught the faintest shift in Lawson's posture, just enough to know that, for the first time, he realized this was going to be a fight he couldn't simply walk away from. Lawson slammed his apartment door behind him, tossing his keys onto the counter hard enough for them to skid to the floor. The pretrial hearing had been nothing more than a formality, but something about it had rattled him. Maybe it was the way Helen hadn't even looked his way. Maybe it was the judge's calm, clipped tone, like she'd already decided who she believed. Dennis Fuller was on the phone with him now, voice low and deliberate. "Derek, if she's got half the evidence she claims, we need to find holes, anything that undermines her credibility. Personal history, questionable decisions at the hospital, conflicts of interest. Something. You think I haven't thought of that?" Lawson snapped, pacing. "I've been asking around all week. Nobody's got dirt on her. It's like she's spotless." "Then dig deeper," Fuller said. "Talk to people who've worked under her. Look for disgruntled employees. If we can't discredit her testimony, we have to weaken it." Lawson ran a hand over his jaw, his mind turning over names: janitors, nurses, old contractors. Maybe someone had a grudge, something they'd be willing to share if the price was right. Meanwhile, across town, Helen was in Robert's office with Sarah Lundy and 2 other witnesses, going over their statements in preparation for depositions. "You're not here to embellish," Robert reminded them. "You're here to tell exactly what happened, in your own words. Don't speculate. Don't guess. Just the truth." Sarah nodded, her voice steady, but her hands clasped tightly together. "If he tries to intimidate me, he won't," Helen cut in, her tone calm but absolute. "Not in that room. Not anymore." She knew Lawson's type. The louder they got, the more it meant they were losing control. And if he was hunting for weaknesses, he'd find none here. What Helen didn't know was that Lawson had just set in motion a plan to dig into her past one that might drag old, unrelated disputes into the light, hoping to muddy the water before the real fight began. The deposition room was plain, just a rectangular table, a few chairs, and a small recording device in the center. No jury, no judge, just 2 lawyers, a court reporter, and the quiet hum of the overhead lights. Sarah Lundy sat at one end, her back straight, her hands folded neatly on the table. Across from her, Dennis Fuller adjusted his cufflinks, offering a thin smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Ms. Lundy, thank you for being here today," he began, voice dripping with practiced politeness. Sarah nodded once. "You're welcome." Fuller glanced at his notes. "Now, on the night of June 14th, you claim that Mr. Lawson approached your residence. Can you explain why he might have done so?" "He said there was a noise complaint." Sarah replied evenly. "And was there?" Fuller asked. "No," she said. "It was quiet. I live alone." Fuller leaned back slightly, the chair creaking. Could it be possible that the noise came from a nearby property and Mr. Lawson simply made an honest mistake? Sarah's gaze didn't waver. "No. He stood on my porch for nearly 10 minutes, asking to come inside and look around. There was no noise. There was no reason for him to be there. Robert Hayes didn't interrupt. He let Sarah hold the ground herself, just as they'd practiced. Her voice stayed calm, her words precise, and every detail matched the written statement she'd submitted weeks earlier. When the deposition wrapped, Fuller closed his notebook with deliberate slowness. "No further questions," he said, but Helen caught the flicker in his expression. Sarah hadn't cracked. She hadn't even leaned back in her chair. Outside in the hallway, Sarah exhaled, her shoulders finally loosening. "Was that okay?" Helen gave her a reassuring smile. "That was perfect." But as they left, Robert's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, his brow furrowing. "Looks like Lawson's lawyer just filed a discovery request for your personnel records at the hospital." Helen's smile faded, but her voice stayed steady. "Let him look. He won't find what he's hoping for." What she didn't say was that she knew exactly what Lawson was doing, trying to make this about her, not him. And if that was the game he wanted to play, she was ready. By the next morning, whispers had started making their way through Bayhaven Regional Hospital. Two nurses in the break room glanced at Helen as she walked past, their conversation dropping to a murmur. An email with the subject line "request for records" had landed in the hospital's HR inbox. And even though it was marked confidential, gossip traveled fast. Robert arrived at Helen's office with a folder in hand. "Fuller's fishing," he said, dropping into a chair. "He's looking for any hint of misconduct, staff complaints, financial irregularities, anything they can twist into a narrative." Helen didn't even look up from the patient safety report she was reviewing. And Robert opened the folder. "Nothing. Your file's clean. The only things in here are commendations, board approvals, and a few stern memos you've sent to underperforming department heads. But he'll try to spin those as you being difficult to work with." Helen set down her pen and leaned back. "Then we beat him to it." That afternoon, she called an all-staff meeting. Every department head, supervisor, and coordinator packed into the hospital's main conference room. She didn't mention Lawson by name. She didn't need to. "You may hear things about me in the coming weeks," she began, her voice clear but measured. "Some will be true, like the fact that I hold this hospital to the highest standards. Some will be twisted because accountability always feels like an attack to those who are used to getting away with more than they should." She let the words settle before continuing. "What matters is that my record speaks for itself, and it's public. Anyone who wants to see it can request it directly from HR. I have nothing to hide." A murmur of agreement passed through the room. Helen didn't smile. She didn't need to. She had just cut off Lawson's smear attempt before it had a chance to grow. Across town, when Fuller learned about the meeting, he called Lawson immediately. "She's not just defending herself," he said. "She's making you look like the one with something to hide." Lawson's grip tightened on the phone. "Then maybe it's time to change tactics." 2 days later, Lawson's voice was on the local AM radio station, his words rolling out with forced calm and careful phrasing. "I've served this town for over a decade," he told the host, "and every decision I've made has been with the safety and well-being of Bayhaven residents in mind. Sometimes enforcement isn't popular, but that doesn't mean it's wrong." It was a soft sell, aimed at painting himself as the misunderstood public servant. The host nodded along, offering easy questions that kept him in safe territory. But then a caller's voice broke through, steady, female, and unmistakably confident. "This is Helen Carter," she said, "and Mr. Lawson, you and I both know this isn't about what's popular, it's about what's lawful. And the record shows you've stepped outside that line more than once." The silence on the line was almost tangible. The host stumbled over a response, but Helen didn't give him time. "I have no interest in trading sound bites," she continued. "I'll speak where it matters in court. Until then, I'd suggest you focus less on the airwaves and more on explaining your actions under oath." The call ended. The segment moved on. But by that evening, clips of the exchange were circulating on social media, and the comments weren't kind to Lawson. In Robert's office the next morning, Helen watched the video on his laptop. "I didn't plan to call in," she admitted, "but I wasn't going to let him use that platform unchecked." Robert closed the laptop with a smirk. "Then I think it's time we take this momentum into the courtroom. The judge set the next hearing for Monday. Let's make sure he walks in knowing the tide's already turning." Helen nodded. Monday, then, the weekend before the hearing, Bayhaven felt like it was holding its breath. Clouds rolled in from the coast, flattening the light, and the streets seemed quieter than usual, as if even the town knew a storm was coming. Helen spent her Saturday in Robert's office, the two of them running through every possible angle of questioning. The witness list was finalized, the exhibits numbered, the video files prepped for instant playback. "Remember," Robert said, tapping the folder in front of her, "we're not just proving he overstepped with you. We're showing the judge and everyone watching that this is part of a pattern. You're not his only victim. You're just the first one who pushed back." Helen glanced at the still frame from her phone footage, Lawson's flashlight beam glaring across her face. "That's the part he won't understand until it's over," she said. "This stopped being about me the moment I found the others." Across town, Lawson sat alone at his kitchen table, the remains of an untouched dinner pushed to one side. Fuller's voice echoed in his head from their last call. "If the videos are as clear as she says, you can't talk your way out of this in front of a judge." He hated that Helen Carter had gotten into his head, hated that every move he made now seemed like a reaction to hers. But more than that, he hated knowing Monday wasn't going to be the end, it was going to be the start of something much bigger. Sunday night, Helen closed her last binder and set it on the stack by the door. She didn't feel nervous. She didn't feel anxious. She felt ready. The morning air in Bayhaven was cool and sharp, carrying the scent of salt from the marina. Helen woke before her alarm, her mind already clear. She moved through her routine without rush coffee, pressed suit, hair pulled back with the same precision she used for board presentations. On her kitchen counter, the neatly stacked binders waited, each tab marked with the kind of organization that told a story before a single word was spoken. Robert would bring the master copies, but Helen liked having her own set. She'd learned long ago that being prepared wasn't about trusting others, it was about removing every excuse for failure. Across town, Derek Lawson's morning looked different. His tie wasn't sitting right, no matter how many times he adjusted it. He'd shaved too quickly, leaving a thin red line along his jaw. The kitchen sink was full of dishes he hadn't bothered to rinse, and the suit jacket he'd picked smelled faintly of stale cologne. Dennis Fuller arrived 10 minutes early, legal pad in hand. "We stick to procedure today," he said, eyeing Lawson carefully. "Answer only what's asked. No side comments. And whatever you do, don't let her bait you." Lawson forced a nod, though inside the idea of being baited by Helen Carter made his blood simmer. He told himself she'd overplayed her hand, that the judge would see her as a crusader looking for a spotlight. But under that layer of bravado, something heavier sat, a quiet awareness that she'd been 2 steps ahead. Since the first envelope landed on his desk, by the time they both arrived at the courthouse, the difference in their energy was stark. Helen walked in steady, composed, with Robert at her side. Lawson came in with Fuller half a step ahead of him, as if shielding him from the eyes already turning in their direction. The bailiff's call to order was the same as before, but this time, the tension in the room felt thicker. Today wasn't about scheduling dates or filing motions. Today, the story would start to unfold on the record, in front of the judge, with everyone watching. Robert Hayes rose from his seat with the quiet confidence of someone who knew his opening words would set the tone for the rest of the day. He buttoned his jacket, stepped into the open space before the bench, and looked directly at Judge Porter. "Your Honor," he began, his voice steady but carrying a weight that filled the room. "This is not a case about a single misunderstanding. This is about a repeated pattern and abuse of municipal authority that has gone unchecked for years." He paced slowly, just enough to draw the court's focus without seeming theatrical. "On January 8th, my client, Helen Carter, was stopped and detained without cause by the defendant, Derek Lawson. She complied with every request. She posed no threat, and yet she was subjected to intimidation and an inspection with no legal basis." Robert let the silence breathe before continuing. "You will hear from multiple witnesses who've experienced the same tactics. You will see video from 2 angles, hers and his, that shows exactly how Mr. Lawson conducts himself when he believes no one will hold him accountable." He stepped back toward the plaintiff's table. "This case is about boundaries, the ones the law sets and the ones the defendant crossed. At the end, We will ask you to acknowledge those violations and make it clear that in Bayhaven, power is not a license to disregard the rules." Judge Porter gave a small nod. "Thank you, Hayes.Mer. Fuller, your opening." Dennis Fuller stood, buttoning his own jacket, and approached the bench with a measured calm. "Your Honor, what you will hear today is a single evening being turned into a crusade. My client was doing his job, responding to what he reasonably believed could be a violation. The plaintiff's interpretation of that encounter is just that, an interpretation. We will show that his actions were within the scope of his authority, and that this case is built on exaggeration, not fact." When Fuller returned to his seat, Judge Porter glanced at Robert. "You may call your first witness." Robert turned to the second row. "Ms. Lundy, please take the stand." Sarah Lundy stepped up to the witness stand, her posture straight, her hands clasped loosely in front of her. The court reporter swore her in, and she settled into the chair, glancing briefly at Helen before focusing on Robert. "Ms. Lundy," Robert began, "could you describe, in your own words, what happened on the evening of June 14th? Sarah's voice was steady. "I was at home, grading papers. It was quiet. Around 9:30, Mr. Lawson came to my door. He said there'd been a noise complaint. I told him there hadn't been any noise, and that I live alone." Across the room, Lawson leaned back in his chair, one leg crossed over the other. At first glance, he looked relaxed, but his jaw tightened each time Sarah mentioned his name. Robert kept his tone neutral. "What happened next?" "He asked to come inside and check things out," Sarah said. "I told him no. He said refusing an inspection was a violation and that he could cite me on the spot. I told him to go ahead. He stayed on my porch for several minutes, trying to get me to change my mind." Fuller tapped his pen lightly against his legal pad, a signal Helen had already noticed. Meant he was preparing to interrupt. Sure enough, he rose for cross-examination. "Ms. Lundy," Fuller began, "isn't it possible that my client was simply ensuring the complaint was addressed thoroughly?" Sarah met his gaze. "I can't speak to what he thought he was doing. I can only tell you what he did." From the defense table, Lawson's eyes narrowed, his foot beginning to tap against the floor. Fuller tried again. "Could it be that you mistook his persistence for intimidation?" Sarah didn't blink. "When someone stands on your porch at night, refusing to leave after you've answered their questions, that's intimidation." A few quiet coughs broke the silence in the gallery. Lawson's tapping stopped, replaced by his hand gripping the armrest of his chair. Fuller finally said, "No further questions." His voice clipped. As Sarah stepped down, Robert caught Helen's eye. The testimony had landed exactly as they'd hoped, and the small twitch in Lawson's posture told them it had landed with him too. When Robert called her name, Helen rose without hurry, smoothing the front of her suit as she walked to the witness stand. The courtroom seemed quieter than it had been all morning. Even the hum of the fluorescent lights felt distant. The court reporter swore her in, and she sat, her back straight, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the wooden armrests. Robert stepped closer, his voice measured. "Ms. Carter, can you describe what happened on the night of January 8th? Helen's eyes stayed on him, her tone calm but unyielding. "I was driving home from the hospital after a late shift. I wasn't speeding, wasn't swerving. There was nothing unusual about my driving. I noticed a dark SUV pull out from the side of the road and follow me. Then the red and blue lights came on." Across the room, Lawson shifted in his chair, adjusting his tie, though it didn't seem to sit any better than it had that morning. Robert nodded. "And when the defendant approached your vehicle, he didn't identify a specific violation?" Helen said, "He demanded my license and proof of residence. When I asked for the reason for the stop, he repeated the demand louder. Eventually, he ordered me to exit the vehicle. Did he provide justification for that order?" "No," she said. "When I asked, he accused me of refusing a lawful order. At that point, I began recording the interaction with my phone." Fuller stood for his cross, his expression calculated. "Ms. Carter, you've held a leadership role at the hospital for over a decade, correct?" "That's correct. So you're used to giving orders. Do you think it's possible you reacted poorly to receiving one?" Helen's gaze was steady. "I follow lawful orders without hesitation. I question unlawful ones." A murmur passed through the gallery. Lawson's lips tightened, the tendons in his neck pulling taut. Fuller tried again. Could it be you were simply uncomfortable being questioned? Helen didn't look away. Uncomfortable, no. Concerned, yes. Because when someone with authority refuses to explain their actions, they're asking you to trust them without reason. And trust is earned, not assumed. Even Judge Porter's eyes flicked up from her notes at that line. Fuller paused, then simply said, "No further questions." Helen stepped down. The click of her heels on the courtroom floor the only sound. She didn't glance at Lawson. She didn't need to. Robert stood, a small remote in his hand, and addressed Judge Porter. "Your Honor, the plaintiff would like to enter Exhibit A into evidence a recording from Ms. Carter's phone, followed by Exhibit B, the defendant's own body cam footage. Synchronized for accuracy." The judge gave a nod. "Proceed." The first frame lit up on the mounted screen, Helen's view from inside her car. The dashboard dimly glowing, the sound of tires on asphalt fading as she pulled over. The jury and the gallery watched as Lawson's flashlight beam cut sharply across the lens. "License and proof of residence." Lawson's voice came from the speakers, sharper than it had sounded in the room just moments earlier. The next minutes unfolded exactly as Helen had described her measured tone, his rising volume, the unexplained demand for her to step out. Robert didn't speak. He let the footage run, knowing the pauses, the tone. The clipped replies said more than any commentary could. Then came Exhibit B, Lawson's own body cam footage. The angle shifted, now showing Helen's calm posture, her hands visible, her voice level. In contrast, Lawson's stance was forward, crowding the space between them, his flashlight trained directly on her face. From the defense table, Lawson sat unnaturally still, jaw tight, eyes locked on the screen. He could feel the weight of the room leaning toward the plaintiff's side with each passing frame. At the point where Helen passed the so-called inspection without issue, the body cam caught something the phone hadn't, Lawson's faint smirk as he wrote the citation. It was subtle, but unmistakable. Robert let the video end in silence before saying, "No further questions for this witness. Your Honor." Judge Porter looked over her glasses at Fuller. "Do you wish to address the evidence?" Fuller hesitated, glancing at Lawson before saying, "Not at this time." It wasn't a concession, but it was the closest thing to one Helen had seen from their side yet. The afternoon light slanted through the high courthouse windows as Judge Porter called for closing statements. The gallery had thinned slightly since the morning, but the air still carried the taut weight of an unfinished fight. Robert rose first, buttoning his jacket and walking to the center of the room. "Your Honor," he began, "you've now heard from multiple witnesses. You've seen video evidence from two angles, one captured by my client, one by the defendant himself, and both show the same thing, an abuse of authority with no legal justification." He let his words hang for a beat before continuing. "This isn't about a single night. This is about a pattern that only stops when someone refuses to stay silent. My client didn't raise her voice, didn't escalate, didn't retaliate. She did the one thing that can cut through intimidation. She documented the truth and brought it here where the law still matters." Robert took a step closer to the bench. "Power without accountability is dangerous, and when it's worn like a shield, it becomes a weapon. We ask this court to affirm that in Bayhaven, no badge, no title, no position places anyone above the law." When he returned to his seat, Fuller rose. His tone was even, but the faint strain in his voice betrayed the weight of the evidence. "Your Honor, the defense maintains that Mr. Lawson acted within the scope of his duties. In the moment, he believed he was addressing a potential violation. Hindsight allows for endless critique, but in real time, split-second decisions must be made." He spread his hands slightly. "To penalize an officer for making a judgment call, even if it is later questioned, risks undermining those who serve our communities. We urge the court to consider intent alongside action." Judge Porter gave a slow nod, her pen tapping once against the legal pad before her. "The court will recess and reconvene for verdict tomorrow at 10 a.m. The gavel struck once, sharp and final. Helen stood, collecting her papers with calm precision, aware of Lawson's eyes on her from across the aisle. She didn't look back. Tomorrow, the court would speak. The next morning, The courthouse felt different, quieter, heavier. Every step down the hall seemed to echo a little longer, as if the building itself knew the weight of what was about to be decided. Helen arrived early, her expression unreadable. The same calm mask she'd worn through the entire trial. Robert walked beside her, carrying only a slim folder. "We've done everything we can," he said softly. "Now we see if it was enough." When Judge Porter entered the courtroom, the murmurs died instantly. She adjusted her glasses, shuffled a few papers, and looked out across the room. "In the matter of Carter versus Lawson," she began, "the court has reviewed the evidence, the testimony, and the exhibits entered into record." Helen kept her gaze fixed on the judge, not allowing herself to glance at Lawson. Though she could feel him shifting in his seat, "The court finds in favor of the plaintiff." "Ms. Helen Carter," Judge Porter continued, "it is the opinion of this court that the defendant, Derek Lawson, acted outside the bounds of his legal authority on the night in question. Further, this conduct constitutes an abuse of power and a violation of the plaintiff's civil rights." A ripple of sound moved through the gallery, quickly silenced by the judge's raised hand. "Damages in the amount of $42,000 are awarded to the plaintiff," Judge Porter said, "and this decision will be entered into the permanent public record. A copy will also be forwarded to the Bayhaven City Council for internal review and policy evaluation." She set her pen down. "This court is adjourned." The gavel struck once, but the sound seemed to hang in the air far longer than usual. Helen exhaled slowly, not smiling, not celebrating, just allowing the weight of the decision to settle. She turned to Robert and gave a small nod. Across the aisle, Lawson sat motionless, his jaw tight, eyes fixed on the table. The shield he'd worn for years, the one made of a badge, a title, and the town's indifference, had cracked in full view of everyone. Helen walked out of the courtroom without looking back. For her, the verdict wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a record that would outlast them both. A week after the verdict, Bayhaven slipped back into its familiar rhythm, the fishing boats unloading at dawn, the gulls squabbling over scraps, the salty wind sweeping through the streets. On the surface, it looked the same, but Helen knew something beneath that surface had shifted. She returned to her office at the hospital as if nothing had changed. Meetings were held, budgets reviewed, staff issues resolved. No speeches, no interviews, no grand declarations. When people stopped her in the hallway to offer quiet congratulations, she simply thanked them and moved on. The real victory, she thought, wasn't in the number on the damages check, it was in the record. In the fact that anyone who searched Derek Lawson's name from now on would see the truth laid out in black and white, backed by evidence and upheld in court. Lawson, for his part, had been placed on administrative leave pending an internal review. Rumors swirled. Some said he'd be reassigned, others that this was the beginning of the end for his career. Helen didn't care which was true. That was no longer her fight. One evening, she stood on the hospital's rooftop terrace, watching the last light sink into the water. A young nurse stepped out beside her, hesitant. "I just wanted to say, what you did, it matters. For all of us." Helen looked at her for a moment, then back at the horizon. "What I did," she said quietly, "was tell the truth and refuse to back down. That's something anyone can do if they decide it's worth it." The nurse nodded, her expression thoughtful. Helen stayed there until the sky faded completely, the cool night air settling around her. The fight was over, but the message remained. Power is a responsibility, not a shield. And sometimes, the quietest stance can echo the loudest.